Previously, we looked at the rise of institutions in the United States and their manifold problems and abuses, and the way in which they serve to define disability as a medical and social problem that needed to be isolated and treated. We also considered how during the Second World War, some 3,000 conscientious objectors performed their public service in these institutions, and in this way, 3,000 Americans who would have never set foot in such an institution and had no connection to the issue were suddenly thrust into a reality that utterly shocked them. They saw the brutal treatment that these institutions inflicted on those in their care, and their horror motivated change. And recall how following the war, they formed the National Mental Health Foundation, and in 1947, Frank Leon Wright published Out of Sight, Out of Mind through the foundation. And remember, the book's subtitle made its purpose utterly clear: a graphic picture of present-day institutions that care for the mentally ill in America, based on more than 2,000 eyewitness reports. The book received praise by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who promoted its call for reform. In 1946, Mary Jane Ward published The Snake Pit, a novel that offered an expose on the treatment of patients in the care of psychiatric facilities, and the novel was largely based on the author's own 9-month experience in New York's Rockland State Hospital, offering a first-hand account from the inside, depicting the loss of freedom and the deprivations that one underwent, and the so-called treatments used on the patients, including electroshock therapy, which the medical establishment believed would shock the patient's brain back to sanity. In 1948, this powerful novel was transformed into a movie of the same name. In this period, some medical experts and scholars began to examine the effects of institutions on people's sense of themselves, arguing that civil liberties were being denied by those in the institutions, that these were in fact the problem, and that the very institutions themselves were dehumanizing. But the process of change was slow, particularly as the public's eyes shifted to other concerns. In 1962, Ken Kesey published One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a novel that offered a critique of psychiatry at the time and the medical model of disability. And the novel was then adapted into a play in 1963 and then a movie in 1975 starring Jack Nicholson. In the same period, 1965, Senator Robert Kennedy visited Willowbrook State School on Staten Island in New York City, and he publicly condemned the horrid conditions there, calling it a snake pit. New York State officials countered with denials and claims that he was sensationalizing and misleading the public. This inspired Burton Blatt, a professor at Boston University, with photographer Fred Kaplan, to visit various institutions in the Northeast in 1965. And these visits produced another expose called Christmas in Purgatory, which showed in graphic detail with photos the overcrowding, the neglect, and the bleak reality of these institutions. In 1971, New York reporter Geraldo Rivera visited Willowbrook, and with TV camera on, again showed the horrific reality to the New York TV audience: overcrowding, mistreatment, and neglect. This was shock journalism, which helped ratings, but it also exposed the horrors of an institution which at that time had more than 4,700 people in its care. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of Wyatt versus Stickney that there must be a minimum standard of care for these institutions. And that standard, in this particular Alabama case it was examining, was not being met. The court ruled that a person in such an institution must receive treatment, rehabilitation, and training. They could not just be abandoned and warehoused. It set a minimum constitutional standard. 3 years later, in 1975, in O'Connor versus Donaldson, the court ruled that a non-dangerous, that's the quote, they used that term, non-dangerous mental patient had a constitutional right to liberty. They could not be arrested and simply held, simply legally warehoused, just because they were deemed different. Let me share one additional court case, that of Youngberg versus Romeo in 1982, where the Supreme Court ruled that people with disabilities in institutions have constitutional rights to safety, to freedom from undue restraint, and to treatment. They deserved protection and care. The post-war movements to expose the problems of institutions and to defend the civil rights of those in them led to the process of deinstitutionalization in the 1980s. Willowbrook, for example, closed in 1983. It had been the purported promise of the institution back in the 19th century, which had combined religious enthusiasm and modern science to perfect and improve humanity. More than a century later, it had proved to become a nightmare for those it sought to help. Institutions closed and were reduced in size. For example, in California, the state's psychiatric hospital population dropped from 37,000 in 1955 to only 2,500 at the present. They were replaced by day programs and new pharmaceuticals. But where did the residents go? For many, on the streets, generating a new challenge with an increase in homelessness. And from there, many individuals with disabilities found themselves in jails and prisons. In this sense, one state institution was simply being used to replace another.